The vast, sleeping bulk of imperial Rome, the center of the known world, required a monumental, continuous, and entirely thankless effort just to be tolerable by day. This essential maintenance began not with the clang of the blacksmith or the shouts of the centurions, but with a sound so low, so rhythmic, and so wet that it served as the secret, almost subaudible pulse of the vast metropolis. This was the scrape of the stiff, bristled scopi, the broom of the vicus purgator, the street cleaner. His life was a monotonous, unending cycle of pushing, shoveling, and hauling the liquid filth of a million souls. His workday began with the passing of the third hour of night, well before the sun offered any thermal respite. The hour was dominated by the deep, pervasive cold that rose from the stone pavement, a chill compounded by the dampness of the narrow side streets, the vici. These vici were the veins of the city, often unpaved or poorly surfaced, lacking the grand drainage systems of the central VA and the cloaca maxima. They were the natural catchment points for all that the city shed: sewage, kitchen slop, industrial effluent, and the pervasive dust of urban decay. The purgator was likely an infames, a person devoid of social status, or a slave, his existence a continuous reminder of the absolute bottom rung of Roman society. His very being was defined by the proximity to the most repugnant aspects of city life. The first sensory assault was the smell, which was not a single, sharp odor, but a complex, viscous atmospheric layer that never dissipated. It was the heavy, almost palpable stink of cesspit overflow and fermenting refuse, the sharp metallic tang of stale urine and ammonia rising from the saturated stones, mixed with the greasy rancidity of old olive oil and cooking fats thrown from upper windows, and the sour, acidic decay of discarded vegetables and fruit pulp. This air was perpetually thick, a noxious cloud that stung the eyes and permeated the thin wool tunic, clinging to the skin and hair until the stench became a permanent, internal part of the worker. The exposure to these concentrated fumes led to chronic respiratory issues and a persistent, low-grade physical malaise that never truly lifted. His tools were simple, crude, and offered no mechanical advantage over the dense accumulation of waste. The scopi was a heavy, stiff implement, often a clumsy bundle of tough, dry rushes, uncus, or coarse broom-rape stems bound tightly with leather thongs. The weight of the broom combined with the continuous resistance of the heavy, compacted filth necessitated a severe, repeated physical effort. He also carried a situla, a large, cumbersome wooden or leather bucket reinforced with bronze hoops, or a smaller, shallow wooden drag box area for scooping. The labor began with the agitation and scraping of the waste. The purgator would plant his feet on the slick, cold stones, often wearing only crude leather sandals or going barefoot, the cold penetrating instantly. He would bend his back low, extending his arms, and begin the brutal process of scraping. The broom was used not merely to sweep light debris, but to pry, loosen, and push the dense, compacted slurry. The motion was a sustained, repetitive arc. Forward and down to scrape, then a rapid pullback to gather the heavy material, then another exhausting push. This continuous bending and exertion stressed the lower lumbar spine, the shoulders, and the forearms in a relentless, fatiguing loop. The constant strain on the abdominal muscles and the pressure on the knees from stabilizing his body against the resistance of the muck meant that pain was his constant physical state. The accumulated waste was incredibly dense. It contained heavy, non-organic material, shattered ceramic shards, testae, small, sharp fragments of bone from discarded meals, grit from the constant erosion of the stone walls, and fine, heavy ash from the hundreds of household braziers that lined the district. Pushing this amalgamation of density and slime along the street required deep core strength. The sound was a monotonous, grating schlick, 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 the wet bristles dragging over the rough stone, punctuated by a heavier, sickening slurp as the broom passed through particularly deep pools of stagnant liquid. Occasionally there was a sharp clink as the broom snagged a piece of broken glass or metal, momentarily jarring the rhythm and threatening to break the fragile bristles. The second phase, the collection, was the most repellent and physically demanding. Once the filth was gathered into manageable piles in the center of the vicus, the purgator had to use his short-handled scoop or drag box to transfer the material into the situla. The wet, putrefying mass, often saturated with dark, stagnant liquids, would be lifted, dripping and heavy, into the bucket. A full situla was a punishing load, easily weighing 50 or 60 Roman pounds, or the equivalent of a fully loaded modern suitcase, making the simple act of lifting it a major effort. The sheer volume of waste demanded dozens of trips. The purgator had to hoist the heavy bucket, the rough wood handle cutting into his already calloused hand, and begin the slow, staggering walk to the designated sterquilinia, the municipal dumping pit or carting area, often located several blocks away, near the less populated districts like the Esquiline or outside the Servian wall. The walk was agonizingly slow, the contents of the bucket often sloshing and spilling onto his own feet and legs, deepening the saturation of filth. The sound of his rough sandals scraping and the low clanging of the bucket hoops against the stones provided the only rhythm to his isolated journey. The weight pulled his torso forward, creating a perpetual hunch, and the repeated action eventually deformed his gait. He performed this grueling circuit, scrape, push, shovel, haul, dump, and return, for 4 to 5 continuous hours. There was no conversation, no camaraderie. He was a solitary figure in a city of millions, his existence defined by the cyclical removal of that which others produced and ignored. The only marker of the passage of time was the increasing ache in his muscles, the spreading saturation of cold sweat that chilled his body when he paused, and the subtle, slow increase in the background noise of the city, transitioning from the lonely yelps of dogs to the sound of early market preparations. He worked against a deadline that was absolute, the sun. His job was to be finished before the wealthy citizens, the patricians, and the successful negotiants began their day and demanded a clean, passable route for their litters or chariots. His function was to make the city aesthetically functional before the public eye could judge its internal decay. The goal was not cleanliness, that was impossible, but the illusion of order. As the light grew pale and gray, washing over the tops of the 7 hills, the vicus purgator would have finished his final haul, retreating into the shadow of a tenement or an alleyway. His life was the very definition of a Sisyphean labor, performed in the dark, where the only monument to his effort was the temporary absence of filth, soon to be undone by the continuous, relentless engine of the waking city. We leave the wet, shadowed streets of Rome and move forward 15 centuries to the high, exposed, and perpetually windswept world of Northern European medieval farming. Here the work is not defined by sanitation or urban decay, but by the relentless, monotonous process of turning earth, the life of the peasant plowman. His labor was the indispensable foundation of feudal society, yet his existence was reduced to a brutal, rhythmic, and technically demanding walk behind a cumbersome tool. The plowman's year was dictated by the 3-field system and the seasons, but his daily reality was dictated by the plow itself. This was often the heavy-wheeled caruca, an essential technological advance that allowed for the deep cutting of the heavy, dense clay soils of Northern Europe. The immense difficulty of the job lay in managing this heavy machine and the massive living power source that pulled it. The day began before the sun, in the damp, freezing air of the paddock. The first task was the harnessing of the oxen or horses. These were large, powerful, and often ill-tempered animals, requiring patient, physical dominance. The sound of the clatter of the wooden yoke being fitted over the beasts' necks, the creak of the heavy leather straps, and the low, guttural snorting of the animals provided the acoustic start to the day. This preparation alone took nearly an hour, a slow, meticulous process to ensure the harness was evenly distributed and would not chafe the animals, as an injured ox meant the entire day's production was lost. Once harnessed, the plowman had to lead the beasts and the caruca to the open field. The plow itself was a nightmare of awkward weight, a heavy timber frame with an iron coulter, knife, a share, wedge, and a mold board, the curved surface that turned the soil. The entire apparatus could weigh several hundred pounds, and maneuvering it, even before it was engaged in the soil, was a continuous struggle against inertia. The true labor began with the cutting of the furrow. The plowman grasped the two stilt handles of the plow, his hands thick with calluses, perpetually coated in dirt and animal sweat. The goal was not merely to drag the plowman had to exert continuous, controlled downward and lateral pressure to keep the share biting into the dense soil and the moldboard turning the resulting ribbon of earth cleanly. If the pressure was too light, the plow would skip over the hardest parts of the soil, leaving an inadequate furrow. If the pressure was too heavy, the plow would dig too deep, exponentially increasing the strain on the oxen and requiring the plowman to exert a terrifying, immediate burst of strength to prevent the team from stalling. The sound of the plowing was the most monotonous feature of the day. The slow, rhythmic clump-clump of the oxen's hooves on the heavy earth. The persistent creak of the straining wooden frame, and the deep, ripping R-R-R-R-I-P of the iron share tearing through the clay, sometimes followed by the sudden, jarring clang as the share hit a buried rock. The plowman walked at a slow, relentless pace, his head down, focused entirely on the 3 inches of earth directly beneath the coulter. The physical and mental effort were immense, demanding constant minute adjustments to the angle and depth of the share, a grueling, focused repetition that lasted until the light failed. If the Roman street cleaner endured the exhaustion of physical saturation, and the medieval plowman fought the resistance of the earth, the Renaissance. Scribe faced a form of suffering that was purely internal, a mental anguish wrought by silence, precision, and the terrifying weight of permanence. We move now from the open field to the cold, cloistered world of the scriptorium, where monotony was packaged not in pounds of soil, but in inches of painstakingly rendered text. The scribe, often a skilled but nameless professional working in a university, a monastery, or a private copying house around the 14th through 16th centuries, was engaged in an occupation that demanded complete mental captivity. He was the human photocopier of his era, locked into a sensory deprivation chamber of his own making. The room itself was generally chilly, even in summer, to protect the priceless parchment and the delicate ink from humidity. Light was precious, usually provided by a single window or, at night, by the flickering, greasy yellow flame of an oil lamp or tallow candle, which cast dancing shadows that played tricks on the fatigued eyes. His posture was the first enemy. Hunched over a slanted wooden desk, the scribe maintained an unmoving, rigid position for 10 to 12 hours a day. His entire universe was reduced to the space between the calamus, reed pen, or penna, quill, and the vellum. The rhythmic sound of his work was not loud. It was the quiet, scratchy shh, shh, shh of the pen nib meeting the treated animal skin, punctuated only by the occasional, softer drip as he replenished the iron gall ink from the small earthenware ink pot, or by the snip of his knife as he resharpened the quill tip, a continuous, distracting maintenance task. The true source of the boredom, however, was the profound disconnect between effort and meaning. The scribe was rarely a scholar, he was a copyist. He was paid by the page, or sometimes even by the line, and his survival depended on speed and absolute fidelity to the source text. He might be copying a lengthy legal codex, a theological tractate on obscure biblical commentary, or a dry administrative registry. His mind was forced to operate in a strange, dissociative state, intensely focused on the shape of the letters, the spacing, the alignment, the punctuation, but actively ignoring the intellectual content. His job was to reproduce symbols, not to absorb knowledge. It was a kind of intellectual self-muzzling. The mind was working, but only on the shallowest, most mechanical layer, leading to a searing internal fatigue where thoughts were forbidden and concentration was compulsory. And hovering above every stroke was the silent dread of the error. A single, significant error, a skipped line, a transposed word, a misrendered proper noun, could compromise the entire manuscript. Unlike digital work, there was no undo button. Correcting an error on vellum was a laborious, messy, and potentially ruinous process involving scraping the surface with a sharp knife, a process known as rasura. The very act of correcting an error introduced a physical blemish and was a public admission of failure, an unbearable break in the meticulous rhythm. The scribe learned to suppress any spontaneous thought, any mental wandering, because a momentary lapse could translate weeks of work into useless scrap. The relentless internal pressure to be perfect in a task that was fundamentally imperfect, human hands copying thousands of symbols, created an acute psychological boredom mixed with anxiety, a state we might call vigilance fatigue. His life was measured in the gradual, agonizing filling of one page after another, the only transition being the slow, painful shift from one aching muscle group to another. We pull away from the dim light of the scriptorium and race out to sea, trading the dread of a misplaced comma for the existential, oceanic terror of isolation. Our next victim of occupational monotony is the lighthouse keeper of the 18th and 19th centuries, a figure whose job was defined by the relentless, non-negotiable rhythm of the light and the soul-crushing absence of human variety. Before the advent of automation and electric power, the keeper's life was a brutal, self-imposed exile atop a tower of stone, lashed by salt spray and deafened by the constant roar of the ocean. His was one of the most socially important but personally miserable jobs in the industrial age. While the scribe suffered from too much focus input, the keeper suffered from a complete lack of meaningful stimuli, forcing his own mind to become his only and often least welcome companion. His job was simple in concept: keep the light burning, but the execution was a sustained 24/7 battle against physics, weather, and the corrosive elements. The day began with the setting of the light at dawn. He had to descend the winding, narrow stairs from the lamp room, often hundreds of steps, carrying the exhausted oil lamps, or, in later centuries, overseeing the complex clockwork mechanisms of the light's rotation. The air in the lantern room at dawn was thick with the smell of burnt whale oil or kerosene, a heavy, suffocating scent that never truly left the tower's interior. The main work consisted of cleaning, polishing, and fueling. The most critical task was the maintenance of the Fresnel lens, the massive, multifaceted glass structure that magnified the light. This required hours of meticulous, hand-on-hand polishing. The glass had to be spotless, every millimeter free of salt, dust, or smoke residue, because a dirty lens could dim the beam and doom a ship. The scribe obsessed over ink lines. The keeper obsessed over smudges. It was a repetitive, circular motion, scrubbing cold glass, then polishing brass, scrubbing glass, polishing brass, the sound of the rag whispering against the smooth surfaces being the only interruption to the external noise of the wind. If the light mechanism was clockwork, the keeper also had to manage the weights and gears. The weights, often massive blocks of iron, slowly descended through the tower's central shaft to power the rotation of the lens. The keeper had to ascend to the top landing every few hours and crank the weights back up. A short, intensely physical burst of effort, followed by hours of passive watching. The sound of the clockwork mechanism was a relentless, metallic tick-tock, tick-tock, a metronome of isolation that marked the slow, painful passage of time. The psychological toll was immense. He was surrounded by an infinite horizon of the same gray sea and sky. There was no change in view, no social interaction, and no variation in his duties. The monotony was often only broken by a terrifying storm, which exchanged the dull ache of boredom for the sheer panic of structural integrity. But even the storm was repetitive. The wind howling, the waves crashing, the tower shuddering, a repetition of violence. Many keepers succumbed to the dwindles, a severe form of isolation-induced madness marked by erratic behavior, paranoia, and deep, profound lethargy. The only purpose of his endless, lonely repetition was the negative goal, to prevent something terrible from happening, a goal that offered no positive emotional feedback. His entire existence was a form of protective meditation, a living monument to the thankless, monotonous task of eternal vigilance, separated from the world he served by miles of churning, indifferent ocean. We leave the isolated stone tower and descend into the cacophonous, suffocating heat of the 19th century industrial cotton mill, where monotony was not a quiet, internal dread, but a physical, relentless oppression imposed by the iron rhythm of the machine. Here the labor was neither the constant heavy resistance of earth nor the fragile concentration required by ink, but the minute endless repetition of the piecer, a key operator, often a child or young woman, whose entire existence was reduced to a fraction of a second. The time it took to tie a knot. The textile mill was a universe of sensory extremes, the opposite of the scribe's cloistered silence. The air itself was a weapon, thick and suffocating, kept artificially hot and humid, sometimes near 90 degrees Fahrenheit, to prevent the delicate cotton thread from snapping in the dry air. This humidity, however, was saturated with bisonosis, the fine, insidious cotton dust that coated the lungs and led to the chronic, terrifying condition known as brown lung. The piecer inhaled this dust with every shallow breath over a 14-hour shift, his or her very breath regulated by the industrial necessity of the thread. But the defining feature of the mill was the noise. It was not a sound, it was a physical force, a dense, continuous wall of sound that vibrated in the bones and caused permanent, debilitating deafness. The sound was the combined, brutal symphony of thousands of metallic parts. The heavy, rhythmic clack, clack, clack of the power loom shuttles racing back and forth. The high-pitched metallic whine of the spinning mule spindles, and the endless thump, thump, thump of the transmission belts slapping against the pulleys. Communication was impossible. The workers were isolated from one another in plain sight, forced into an internal world of purely reactive action. The piecer's job was to work the spinning frames or the mules. As the cotton fiber was stretched and twisted into thread, it broke constantly due to flaws, tension, or the inevitable chaos of rapid motion. The piecer's sole purpose was to spot these breaks, a visual challenge in the blur of the moving machinery, and, without stopping the enormous, dangerous apparatus, to piece the two broken ends together. This required a quick, darting movement, a momentary pause to catch the ends, a fast lick of the thread to moisten and bind the fibers, and a rapid twist to knot them together, all executed in the time it took for the thread to move a few inches. The physical choreography of this job was punishingly monotonous. The piecer spent the entire day on their feet, walking what became known as the piecing gait, a strange, fast, ducking shuffle along the narrow aisles of the frame. It was a continuous cycle of spotting, lunging, knotting, and stepping, repeated thousands of times a day. Their hands were the most abused instruments, perpetually stained black with grease and oil, the skin dry, chapped and cracked from the constant handling of the rough, dry cotton, the fingertips worn nearly smooth from the necessary, repeated wetting and twisting. The monotony was the total subordination to the machine. The human was simply a highly skilled sensor and repair mechanism. The machine set the pace, the machine set the noise level, and the machine dictated the physical movement. The piecer could never rest, could never pause, because the production was measured in continuous, uninterrupted output. The moment a thread broke, the machine was costing the owner money, and the piecer was therefore failing. This was the ultimate form of occupational boredom. The mind was simultaneously intensely focused on a tiny, repetitive action, the knot, while the body was held captive by the immense roaring scale of the industrial complex. The entire universe was the narrow, greasy passage between two roaring machines, and the only goal was the endless mending of something that was engineered to break. As the 20th century dawned, a different kind of monotony arose, trading the roaring violence of the mill for the sterile, calculated rhythm of the modern office. Our next subject is the typist or keying clerk of the early 1900s, who faced a purely mental form of repetitive strain, measured not in broken threads, but in the relentless, uniform click of the keys. The transition from the old scribe to the new typist was the transition from craft to systematized data processing. The typist's job was to transcribe, to move information from one medium, handwritten ledger, verbal dictation, to another, the permanent, standardized typewritten page. The content was universally boring. Endless lists of inventory, dry correspondence, columns of financial figures, or the brutal uniform text of a legal contract. The brain was engaged in a deep form of dissociative transcription, reading words and numbers, yet forbidden from contemplating their meaning, lest concentration lapse and an error creep in. The entire environment was engineered for monotonous efficiency. The office was often a vast open room, clean and brightly lit compared to the mill, but devoid of personal comfort or visual interest. The sound of this new environment was the definitive feature, the relentless staccato clack-a-chunk of the manual typewriter. Clack as the finger drove the heavy key down against the paper, and ka-chunk as the typist's hand forcefully threw the carriage back to start the next line. Multiply this by 100 desks, and the office became a collective, rhythmic factory of sound, a dry, metallic echo of the mill's mechanical dominance. The typist's hands, trained in the new science of touch typing, performed the work automatically, the movement divorced from conscious thought. The fingers operated on muscle memory, a precise micro-choreography of repetition. They struck the keys with force, necessary to leave a clean, dark impression through the carbon paper, for duplicates, onto the heavy bond stock. The strain was concentrated, leading to early undiagnosed forms of repetitive strain injury, RSI, chronic pain, numbness, and aching wrists and forearms from the continuous, forceful striking motion. The shoulder and neck, held stiffly over the machine, also suffered from the rigidity of the required posture. The psychological pressure came from the tyranny of accuracy. Before the widespread use of correction fluid, liquid paper, a major mistake often meant removing the entire sheaf of paper, carefully erasing the mistake, which often left a telltale smudge, or, in the worst-case scenario, retyping the entire page. This forced the typist into the same state of hypervigilance as the scribe, but at machine speed. The reward for this intense, focused monotony was the slow, inevitable growth of the pile of finished paper, a monument to thousands of words rendered perfectly, none of which the typist would ever read again or care to remember. This was the suffering of the paper trail, the endless creation of uniform documents that reduced the human worker to an input-output device, a tireless engine of perfect, sterile text. As the 20th century progressed, the monotony of human labor shifted again, moving from the physical demands of the factory floor and the mental strain of the office desk to the purely psychological toll of waiting, watching, and reacting to non-events. The next phase of modern boredom is represented by the air traffic controller, ATC, in the decades following World War II. A job that is perhaps the ultimate definition of high-stakes, low-action tedium. The ATC, perched in the control tower or buried deep in the radar room, was tasked with monitoring the invisible ballet of air traffic. This job was not physically demanding. The ATC mostly sat, and it was not repetitive in the way Notting Thread was. Instead, the monotony was psychological, rooted in a perpetual state of suspended anticipation. For hours, nothing would happen. The radar screen remained calm, the radio silent, save for the low-level, predictable chatter. The ATC was forced to maintain a state of 100% focused readiness for an event that might only happen once in a shift, or perhaps once a month. An emergency, a weather anomaly, or a near miss. The environment itself amplified this state of hypervigilance. The radar room was often dark, cooled, and quiet, designed to eliminate distractions and focus the controller's eyes entirely on the glowing green sweep of the planned position indicator, PPI screen. The sound was not the clacking of keys or the roar of a loom, but the electronic hum of the equipment and the rhythmic, soft beep, beep, beep of the radar antenna sweep, a subtle hypnotic sound that was meant to indicate function, but often became a mental drone. The ATC's universe was reduced to the blips on the screen, small geometric icons representing massive, fast-moving machines full of people. The controller's actions were precise, linguistic, and procedural, clearing a plane for descent, assigning an altitude, correcting a heading. These actions, when performed correctly, were smooth, predictable, and thus boring. The successful execution of the job meant nothing happened, but the boredom masked a profound and terrifying responsibility. The knowledge that a 2-second lapse in concentration, a missed radio call, or a transposed number could instantly result in catastrophic failure meant that the mind could never truly relax. This led to a unique form of exhaustion, monitoring fatigue. The brain, starved of new stimuli, begins to create its own, leading to distraction, micro-sleeps, or the dangerous illusion of a non-existent threat. The ATC's life became a battle against their own mental processes, trying to keep the concentration high while the task output remained stubbornly low. The true job was not controlling aircraft, but controlling their own boredom in the face of imminent, invisible catastrophe. The relief of an uneventful shift was also the source of the next shift's anxiety, the long, eternal wait for the event that must not occur. We now move to a subject whose monotony is defined not by speed or silence, but by the relentless linearity of the post-war industrial system, the automotive assembly line worker, particularly the spot welder or fitter of the mid-20th century. This worker's existence was governed by the unwavering pace of the conveyor belt, reducing human effort to a fixed 5-second repeatable cycle. While Henry Ford's original assembly line defined mechanical repetition, the mid-century line, with its faster speeds and more complex processes, perfected the art of human standardization. The worker stood in a fixed, precisely marked spot on the factory floor, a small, permanent island in a huge, noisy, brightly lit industrial ocean. The environment was overwhelming. The air was metallic and smoky, full of the acrid smell of ozone from the welding guns, and the sound was a continuous industrial roar punctuated by the powerful, percussive clang-sh-t of hydraulic presses and the repeated, sharp Z-Z-K of the spot welders. The worker's specific task was typically defined by the time study, a management method that broke down every action into its most efficient micro-movements. For instance, the spot welder might have 48 seconds to perform their task before the next chassis arrived, but that task consisted of 9 identical welds. This meant a cycle of 5.3 seconds per weld. Reach, position gun, press, wait for ZZZK, release, return. This movement was not creative, analytical, or even particularly skilled. It was a robotic dance dictated entirely by the conveyor belt. The monotony of the line was the tyranny of the fixed cycle. The worker was reduced to a biological clock, a living appendage of the machinery. Their consciousness was forced to operate in this tiny, repeating loop, the brief moment of effort, followed by the agonizingly short, empty pause, only to begin the exact same movement again as the next car body slid into position. It wasn't the total hours that killed the spirit, but the total number of cycles, thousands of identical, pointless actions performed over the course of a day. The psychological result was extreme alienation. The worker rarely saw the finished product. They saw only a fragment of a car, a door panel, or a wheel well. There was no ownership, no pride of craftsmanship, only the dull, heavy pressure to maintain the required pace. Any deviation, a sneeze, a tired muscle, a momentary distraction, resulted in the chain being broken, forcing the worker to run alongside the moving car to complete their task. A terrifying, embarrassing, and physically exhausting error known as getting behind the line. Their suffering was the deep spiritual exhaustion of unnecessary perfection. They became experts in a movement that had no meaning outside the profit margin of the company. A movement so simple that the brain constantly rejected it, yet the body was forced to repeat it. The body performed the labor, but the mind was left to drift in a sea of its own making, constantly bumping into the hard metallic wall of the 5-second cycle. The late 20th century saw the rise of a new and pervasive form of monotony, emotional labor, where the repetitive task was not of the hands or the gaze, but of the forced smile and the prescribed voice. We entered the soundproofed, fluorescent-lit world of the call center agent, a template where boredom is an intricate tapestry woven from interpersonal frustration and algorithmic measurement. The environment of the call center, the vast, sprawling cubicle farm, was designed for maximum density and minimum distraction, creating a paradox of intimate isolation. Visually, it is an ocean of beige and gray. Beige carpets, gray dividers, and the flat, constant light of the monitor glow. The air is stale, perpetually recycled, and often carries the faint, unidentifiable smell of weak, burned coffee and cheap plastic. The agent's world, however, is confined to a 4-foot square space, centering around the headset and the screen. The central sound of this environment is a dense, constant white noise generated by hundreds of overlapping, partially muffled conversations, an eternal hum of human complaint and polite scripted refusal. The rhythm is dictated by the automatic call distributor, ACD system, which ensures that as soon as one interaction ends, the next begins with a sharp, persistent beep in the earpiece and the screen lighting up with a new anonymous caller ID. The job is an uninterrupted sequence of human problems. The monotony for the call center agent is not just hearing the same problem, but giving the same mandated response. The core, repetitive act is the performance of feigned empathy. The agent is required to listen to a new stranger's unique frustration, a billing error, a broken product, a forgotten password, and then translate that real human anger into a sequence of pre-approved, soothing phrases. I understand how frustrating that must be, followed by the necessary resolution steps. The brain, attempting to process 60 to 100 such cycles in a shift, enters a state of scripted numbness, where the words are spoken correctly but are completely disconnected from genuine feeling or thought. The pressure of the job is measured by the unforgiving metric of the average handle time, AHT. This statistic dictates how long the agent is allowed to spend on each call. The pressure to lower AHT forces the agent to cut short, authentic human interaction, creating an artificial, urgent rush that distorts conversational flow. The agent is constantly balancing the need to sound compassionate with the need to be ruthlessly efficient, a conflict that wears down the vocal cords and the emotional reserve. The boredom is the crushing repetition of caring without feeling, forcing the interior self to act contrary to the reality of the moment, over and over, until the line goes silent, only to beep again. In the same era, another worker emerged whose physical labor was secretly governed by the same cold logic of the algorithm, the e-commerce fulfillment worker, who physically touches the items we order with a click. Their monotony is the paradox of continuous motion within a fixed pattern, directed by an invisible, calculating master. The modern fulfillment center, often called a warehouse but more accurately a cathedral of logistics, is vast, stretching out of sight, filled with an organized chaos of stacked goods. The atmosphere is cold, echoing, and intensely illuminated by thousands of powerful LED lights. The sounds are mechanical and digital, the continuous whir of conveyor systems, the repetitive clack and drone of robotic, self-driving carts moving bins, and the constant, high-pitched beep of handheld barcode scanners. The worker, known as the picker or stocker, is entirely guided by a small wrist-mounted or handheld device that acts as a digital leash. The monotony of the job is the execution of a single, perfect loop. The algorithm tells the human where to go, what to take, and where to place it. The worker walks miles per shift, but the walking is utterly devoid of purpose beyond the immediate instruction. They do not decide the path, they are merely the most flexible part of the machine. For the picker, the task is reduced to a thoughtless, physical-digital interaction. 1. Walk. Follow the arrow on the screen to the designated shelf. 2. Scan. Point the gun and beep the location code. 3. Identify. Find the exact item dictated by the screen. 4. Scan. Beep the item's barcode. 5. Deposit. Place the item in the outbound bin. 6. Repeat. Await the next instruction. This cycle repeats hundreds or thousands of times, the worker's mind disconnected from the objects themselves. They handle everything from dog food to high-end electronics, but the items are meaningless. Just numbers on a screen, all sharing the same beep, grab, drop sequence. This induces a profound form of digital alienation, where the world of physical objects is reduced to abstract data points. The pressure comes from the unseen, ever-present rate, or the number of items to be processed per hour. The algorithm tracks the worker's efficiency in real time, calculating the seconds spent walking, scanning, and pausing. This creates a constant, measured haste where the worker cannot slow down, cannot daydream, and cannot fall behind the machine's relentless calculation of their optimal pace. The body is exhausted from walking and lifting, but the mind is bored by the lack of variety, stuck in the scan and move loop, a human cog in the complex final machine of global consumption. The final iteration of monotonous labor brings us to the present day and the unseen infrastructure of our most advanced technologies. Ghost work. This is the labor performed by the data annotator or content moderator, whose job is the quiet, repetitive task of manually creating the intelligence that allows artificial intelligence, AI, to function. Their work is the boring, foundational layer of the future. The workspace of the ghost worker is often remote, digital, and silent, defined by the glowing rectangle of the monitor. The atmosphere is purely cognitive, devoid of the physical sounds of the factory or the voices of the call center. The only sound is the rhythmic click of the mouse and the quiet hum of the computer fan. The environment is one of total intellectual isolation, where the worker interacts solely with lines of code, images, and text snippets. The monotony is one of relentless, granular judgment. The worker is fed an endless stream of ambiguous digital content and asked to categorize it, to label it, or to clean it. For an autonomous vehicle system, this might involve drawing bounding boxes around every pedestrian, traffic light, and fire hydrant in thousands of video frames. The same object, slightly changed, frame after frame. For a voice assistant, it is the repeated transcription of garbled, accented, or mumbled audio, converting messy human speech into perfect data points. For a content moderation system, it is the constant, required exposure to the worst elements of the internet, images of violence, hate speech, and abuse, and applying the correct, painful label to each item. The core repetitive act is the application of human context to machine ambiguity. It requires continuous, low-level micro-judgment. The worker must decide hundreds of times an hour whether a shape is a car or a truck, whether a comment is offensive or very offensive, whether a facial expression is happy or contemptuous. The brain, forced into this state of perpetual, fine-grained decision-making, experiences a unique form of cognitive exhaustion, a fatigue born not of physical strain, but of continuous, petty analysis. Just as with the call center agent and the picker, the ghost worker is tethered to a digital metric: tasks per hour. The software tracks the speed and accuracy of every label applied, creating an algorithmic panopticon where performance is constantly visible and measured. The pressure is immense. Low accuracy or speed means fewer tasks and lower pay, forcing the worker to maintain a rapid pace despite the inherent difficulty of the judgment calls. They are paid based on microtransactions, pennies for every label, which drives a relentless, measured haste that leaves no room for thought or pause. This labor completes our journey through the history of monotony, from the rhythmic, deafening clang of the 19th century forge, through the scripted beep of the call center, and finally to the quiet, rapid click of the annotator's mouse. The essential boring loop remains: the human being reduced to the most flexible, low-cost component of an immense optimizing system. The nature of the repetitive act changes, but the experience of measured, alienated boredom remains the enduring condition of the industrial age, now fully digitized.